Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Saudi Arabia or Jeddah post-race reaction. What was your thoughts on this race? I thought it was a really good race. I didn't have quite as much action as last week, but I think we had a lot more tension on who was actually going to be the forerunner in this race. I mean, I know it looked like Oscar was going to have it in hand for the most part, but there's that thought of Max Verstappen coming back through the field and taking over, or even potentially Lando Norris going really long, switching to a set of softs, and potentially coming back and putting more pressure on those front runners. So I think overall in that, maybe not this just necessarily the first position, but those first three positions, definitely we had a lot more tension involved on who was going to be in the top three and for the podium positions. And I think that gave me the little bit extra edge I wanted from last week. So I will rate this probably a 7. I thought it was a fairly good race. It wasn't a perfect race. We had a little bit of other things going on, but I really liked this race overall. So what was your thoughts on this race? Like normal, I start from the back of the pack and work my way forward. And I'll go through each driver telling you what I know about what happened to them during the race, and what my thoughts were, if I have any general thoughts, if I knew enough about what's going on for them in this race. So without further ado, we'll start off with Pierre Gasly, who started off in 9th, ended up in 20th with the DNF because of a contact with Yuki Tsunoda in turn 4 on lap 1. He just kind of got squeezed over into that wall and did enough damage that it could not proceed further. And so he kind of ended his day short, which is a very much a shame, I think, because Pierre Gasly was coming back again fairly strong this race. And I was thinking that he was going to get some points as well. So expanding those points for Alpine, which they strongly need in this quite tight constructors battle that they're having here. So it's kind of a shame that he got knocked out so early, and that it was kind of his friend that kind of did it. It looked like it was not a intentional thing or anything that was truly risky. I think it was just more of those racing incidences on lap 1. And then Yuki Tsunoda was the other person that got knocked out, so he came in the 19th after starting off in 8th. He had contact again with Pierre Gasly on that turn 4-ish, 5-ish, lap 1 kind of contact. He spun. He was able to make it back to the pits where they kind of looked that car over and determined that it was too much damage to repair during this race, and so they decided to just retire it. So unfortunately for him, and he was coming back a little bit stronger in that Red Bull, trying to get his footing down where he can really show that he deserves to be in that Red Bull seat. And it seems like he's making a fairly good progress in that Red Bull, so it's kind of a shame for him to get knocked out so early as well. Then we come to the end runners. We have Gabriel Bortoleto, who started off in 20th and ended up in 18th. He gained 2 spots mainly because of that contact that we had that knocked out Gasly and Yuki. He did a 1 stop, which is kind of strange in my view, since he stopped on lap 1 during that safety car, switched from a set of mediums and went to the set of hards, and went the rest of the way on those set of hards. And he still didn't get up farther than that 18th position. So that was either the wrong strategy, or he wasn't have enough car behind him to really push forward in that strategy scenario. So unfortunately, he is back to the pack again. He did swap positions with Hülkenberg, his teammate, on lap 43 for the 16th position, dropping him back, and then he lost a couple of more positions later during the pit strategies. Then we come to Jack Doohan, who started off in 17th and ended up in 17th. He did gain 2 spots like normal for a lot of these people because of those 2 incidents that knocked those 2 drivers out. He did a 2-stop, stopped on lap 1, switching from mediums to a set of hards, and then on lap 32 he switched to another set of hards. And at one point I was thinking he was going to do fairly well. He was getting close to that point range, fighting out, and something happened, either because of the strategy or what, but he ended up not really making it very far up into the field, ending where he started off in that 17th position. So hopefully he can get a better grip in that Alpine next race in a couple of weeks, so that he can really kind of get a footing for him, because right now it's kind of lacking a little bit for Jack Doohan, and I really want him to be able to give it his all for these races so he doesn't get that swap out with other drivers in the future. Then we come to Lance Stroll, who started off in 16th and ended up in 16th. He was the person who had gained the most dropouts in Q1 this weekend, and I loved his comment about, well, if you put drivers in that Sauber for 10 years, they would be in that position too. And I'm thinking, well, the Aston Martin's not supposed to be in the back of the pack, and he should be a better driver or should be able to be moving around in the teams to get moved up into a different position, not necessarily in the back of the pack with the bad drivers. So I thought that was kind of funny in that regard, even though it's not the best stat to actually have on your record. He did gain 2 spots at the very beginning of the race. He did have a 1 stop going all the way up to lap 39 on a set of hards before switching to a set of mediums, and he did pass Bortoleto on lap 47 for 18th position. But again, Stroll's again in the back of the pack, which I don't foresee. He wasn't quite up there with his teammate. I think he needs to be a little bit better. Those first 2 races were looking good, and then these last several looked fairly bad from my view. So I'm not sure what's going on with Lance Stroll. Then we come to Nico Hülkenberg, who started off in 18th, worked his way up to 15th. And that's pretty good, I think, in that Kick Sauber car. He did gain 2 spots like the rest of the folks at the back because the people that got knocked out. He did a 1 stop going to lap 33 on a set of hards before switching to a set of mediums, and he swapped with Bortoleto on lap 43 for that 15th position. So he didn't have a whole lot of action trying to go the long distance on that set of hards and switching to a set of mediums, which worked out a little bit, but not quite as much as I think they were hoping for in this race. Then we come to Esteban Ocon, who started in 19th, ended up in 14th. Again, he gained 2 spots at the very beginning of that first lap, and he went the 1 stop, stopping on lap 1, switching to a set of hards and going the rest of the way, kind of like Bortoleto, but he was able to get a little bit more out of that than Bortoleto was, and he did swap with Behrman on lap 41 for that 14th spot, where he ended up. So he did a fairly good job, I think, due to the strategy. He didn't have a whole lot of action running around the back of the pack for the most part. I know the Haas's weren't looking that great this weekend with that fix they had to kind of compromise some of these areas. So hopefully they can get some more updates coming up, and maybe coming in Miami or something, they'll have some extra features that they can really apply to that car and kind of get into that mix. And then we have Oliver Behrman, which I think did a decent job. He started off in 15th and ended up in 13th position. He gained 2 spots like the rest of the folks. He did a 1 stop, stopping on lap 18 from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Bortoleto on lap 27 for 17th, passed Doohan for 16th on lap 31, and swap positions with Ocon on lap 41 for that 13th spot. Just outside the points, not really able to put much pressure to gain those extra few spots to get him back into the point range. And I know he was hoping for a nice weekend. I think he did okay compared to where that Haas was this weekend, but they need to do something about that car for these kind of stretches that really have the high speed. So we'll have to see how that works out in the future for them. Then we come to Liam Lawson, who started off in 12th and ended up in 12th. He did a 1 stop, stopping on lap 20, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. Like most of the field started off with mediums and not the hards, so he was like the most of the regular field. He did pass Alonso on lap 15 for 11th, passed Bortoleto for 15th on lap 25, passed Doohan for 14th on lap 28, passed Ocon on lap 33 for 13th, and passed Stroll for 11th on lap 37. But he then got a 10-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. I can't remember what pass that was. I wasn't sure if that was Ocon or where that he ended up going off the track, but he ended up getting a 10-second penalty for that, which then pushed him back into that field, which if he could clean up his act a little bit, I think he should be fairly decent. I like Lawson quite a bit in general. I liked when he came in last year. So I have a hard time seeing him struggling this year, and I'm thinking he's starting to get his grip and get those car under him. So I think we'll see better results in the future, but he just needs to clean up his act and not really get those penalties from causing collisions or going off the track to really help him out in that regard. So if he can keep that up, maybe he'll be doing a little bit better in the future, but until that happens, we'll have to, fight those last few positions. And then we come to the last spot on the bottom 10 with Fernando Alonso, who started off in 13th and ended up in 11th. He did gain 3 spots at the very beginning of the race, so he did actually gain that extra spot. He did a one stop and stopped on lap 19, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did pass Duhan for 15th on lap 29 and passed Stroll for 12th on lap 39. So he didn't have a whole lot of action, but he did pass a few cars, even though one of them was his teammate. And that Aston Martin just doesn't have enough to, where it needs to be this season. I think they're kind of having a gamble for next season, it sounds like, with all their efforts on that. So I'm not sure how much upgrades they're going to have. So I think they're going to be struggling for most of this season, unfortunately. And unfortunately, there's some rumors going around about who's going to be in that seat next season. So we'll have to see if Fernando will continue his contract with Aston Martin for the 2026 season and see if he can actually give some developments to help them out this year. I know he's generally does some pretty good strategy manipulations, but we'll have to wait and see how the rest of the year falls out. I know they've started good in the past and they've tailed off, the mid and the end of the season. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out this season since they're not starting off so well this season either. So as I said, they may be trying to focus all on 2026. So we'll have to wait and see when that comes around. Now we make it to the top 10 where we have Isaac Haijar, who's doing a really good job. I think as a rookie coming in and getting points, even if that Racing Bulls seems to be better than most of the midfields. He's still trying to play out through all that. And I think he's doing a really good job, even though he had that issue on that very first race with the rain. I think he's coming back strong, showing what he can do in this. And this is another example of that, starting off in 14th and gaining all the positions up to that 10th position to gain that last point. He did have 3 spots that he gained on that very first lap, so he did fairly well there. He did a one-stop race, stopping on lap 34, switching from one of the hard tires, so he's one of the few people that started off on a hard tire, and switching to that medium tire. He did pass Alonso on lap 4 for 10th, and passed Duhan for 12th on lap 27, and was kind of maintained that 12th area, kind of gaining some positions through the pit stop strategies and the like, holding up that, putting pressure on Alexander Albon and Carlos Sainz and those Williams, which were working together to try to hold them back. So I think he's doing a really good job in that Racing Bull. Then we come to Alexander Albon, who I think again was doing fairly well, getting the most out of that Williams that they could with strategy and whatnot. Said playing that team game, where Carlos is just staying up ahead of front him to get that DRS, but maintaining the DRS for the person in front of him, trying to keep that and keep the tires all aligned as well, not wearing those tires out. I think they're doing a fairly good job team-wise. I think they need a little bit more work on that car, but I think they're doing a really good job getting back in the double points. So Alexander started in 11th and ended up in 9th. He gained 2 spots at the very beginning on that first lap. He had a one-stop, stopping on lap 22 from mediums to a set of hards. He passed Borletto for 14th on lap 24, passed Duhan for 13th on lap 25, passed Hulkenberg for 11th on lap 29, and passed Stroll for 10th on lap 32, stuck behind his teammate. So a good job for him, and I think a really good job for Carlos getting up there in that 6th position, who's coming in next. So he started off in 6th and ended up in 8th. So he lost a couple of positions, but I know he's kind of having to change his mentality of not trying to really fight and cause some issues with his car and the tires like he did last week, where he was up front, but then trying to fight and keep up with those, and then that cost him and made him drop out of that race. So I think this time he did a lot better job of doing that and gaining points all together. So it's really good to see Carlos getting his footing back under him, figuring out where he can do what he can do with that Williams and how he can get the most out of that car and the team in general. So I said he was kind of playing that team game, keeping that gap between him and Alex within a second so that Alex had a DRS while keeping himself in that DRS front without wearing out the tires. So he was doing a fairly good job there, I think, overall this race. He did lose a spot at the very beginning of the race, but that's not too terrible bad since he was able to get up there so nicely in that qualifying session. He did a one-stop, stopping on lap 21, switching from mediums to a set of hards. He passed Duhan for 12th on lap 24, passed Hulkenberg for 10th on lap 27, and passed Stroll for 9th on lap 31. Then we come to the back of the Ferraris with Lewis Hamilton, who started off in 7th and ended up in 7th. He did gain one spot at the very beginning of that first lap. He did a one stop and stopped on lap 23, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He had a nice good fight with Lando, passing Lando for 6th spot on lap 13, and then coming back around and passed him again for that 6th spot for 14th, but then eventually Lando was able to get around him and at the right spot and take that spot away from him. So overall, I think he was having some fun, even though it didn't look the best for him in that Ferrari. Ferrari is still struggling. I think their strategy is coming together a little bit better this weekend, but not quite where they wanted it to be. I think Lewis is playing a little bit of strategy, trying to figure out where they should pit and having those two different strategies to see which one would play out the best. And so I think he just kind of got the bad end of the stick this time, not necessarily purposely, but it was just the way things laid out with all the tire deg and the way they didn't have an extra safety car or anything else to play into that realm. So I think he just did a decent job, just not the greatest job overall. Then we come to Kimi Antonelli, who started off in 5th and ended up in 6th. He had a one-stop race, stopping on lap 19, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. And he did pass Isaac Kajjar for 6th on lap 30. So otherwise, he had a nice, clean race, kind of sticking behind people, not getting in a lot of trouble. Another good run for Kimi in that Mercedes, trying to keep up with Russell in those realms. So he's just right behind Russell in this. So he didn't do horribly. He didn't do bad. He did actually fairly well, considering that he's a rookie and he's kind of still up there with his teammate who has had a lot of experience in this kind of scenarios. So I think he's doing a really good job overall, and I think he's continuing to show. And so I think Russell's probably going to have some work on his hands fairly soon to try to keep Kimi behind him overall in that Mercedes team. So I think Kimi is doing a really good job in this run as a rookie, and I think he's getting his feet behind him. So we'll have to see how Russell handles that in the future. Now we come to the top 5, where George Russell was. Started off in 3rd and ended up in 5th. He had a one-stop race, stopping on lap 20 from a set of mediums to a set of hards, and he really struggled with some tires. He was really pushing those tires, and he was questioning the strategy on the radio a couple times, asking about whether the tires were going to hold or how bad those tires were running off. He was able to maintain that, though, and do a decent job coming in 5th. Not quite where he wanted to be, I know, losing a couple positions and getting off the podium. But overall, I think that's kind of where Mercedes played out this weekend. So I think they did a really good job of getting the most out of that Mercedes they could this weekend. Now we come to Lando Norris, who started off in 10th after crashing in qualifying. Kind of hurt himself this weekend in most of that regard. That crash, trying to put way too much effort and pressure on himself, I think. So it just got to him in that qualifying session, so that he ended up having to start off in that 10th position, where he did a decent job from that position. It's just that if he could have stayed up a little closer, he would have had a better chance of putting more pressure on his teammate and getting on the least of the podium, if not really fighting for that first position. He said he started off in 10th, ended up in 4th. He did gain 2 spots at the very beginning of the race. He did do a one-stop, stopping on lap 34, switching from a set of hards to a set of mediums, so he went really long on those set of hards. I have him passing Sainz for 7th on lap 7, passing Lewis for 6th on lap 13, passing Lewis again on lap 14 for 6th, and then finally making it stick on lap 15 for that 6th position. Then catching up to Kimi and passing Kimi on lap 19 for that 5th position, then passed Russell for 4th on lap 41. He also gained the fastest lap for this race, so he did really good at the end of the race on those medium tires, after he switched back, coming off and trying to put more pressure, he just didn't quite get up there to really fight Russell until the end. And so then he finally got past Russell, trying to get closer to Charles Leclerc, was getting that gap down, but not quite where he needed to be to actually put a little bit more pressure on Charles Leclerc and even, potentially pass him in that run. So a good run, just not the best aspect, mainly because of the qualifying session more than his drive. I know he's coming back and he says he has to work on his Saturdays over his, overall aspect of it. And I'm not sure if it's necessary the Saturdays. I think it's more that pressure that he's putting on himself, trying to get the most out of those areas and then making those small mistakes that are costing him big time. I think if he could just kind of let that flow over him, not necessarily have that pressure aspect fester and make those mistakes, I think he'll be doing a really good job. But it also makes it a really interesting season as we have the battle between the two McLarens and who's going to come out on top. I know I've seen lots of little memes and stuff saying that Oscar, where Oscar is on the runnings, and Oscar is going to come out and win the Drivers' Championship this year. And it's going to be all for nothing for Lando Norris, unfortunately. So we'll have to see if that plays out or if Lando Norris can really get his mental capacity down and put a lot more pressure on his teammate and potentially win out on that Drivers' Champion himself, if not someone else coming in and taking advantage of their conflict. Then we come to that fourth position where Charles Leclerc was started off in fourth and ended up in third. He did a one-stop going all the way to lap 29 on a set of mediums, so a fairly long run on that set of mediums before switching to a set of hards. And the only pass that he really had to do was passing Russell for third on lap 38. He did a really good job overall, I think, in that Ferrari. They were kind of struggling pretty much this whole weekend, and for them to come out of qualifying so far behind and yet still, finagle a way to get back on the podium was a really good job for them in this regard. So I think there's still a lot of work for them to do to fix that car, to get that more competitive with the McLarens and potentially the Red Bulls and Mercedes. But they're on their way towards that, and hopefully they'll get some updates that'll help them out. But in this regard, I think Charles Leclerc did a really good job in that Ferrari with the car that he had and got the most out of it and getting them back up onto that podium. Then we come to Max Verstappen, who started off in first and ended up in second. He had a one-stop stopping on lap 21 from a set of mediums to a set of hards. And he had that 5-second penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage against Oscar Piastri on that first cornerish, on that first lap where Oscar got a really good drive and got beside him. In my view, he was in the lead. So it was a valid, penalty. I think they probably should have given that spot up in the race without having to get the penalty involved, and maybe he could have fought back because he could have probably given that spot up in a more desirable spot and maybe able to use that DRS to his advantage and take him back to that lead because he was coming back fairly strong in this race, even with that 5-second penalty. Driving up, I know he seemed to be fairly mad at the end of the race, didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to say his true feelings because he knew he was going to get fined for that in regards to how his spoken mannerism. I don't know, he was trying to keep things short, more to the point, more lately. So hopefully that was part of it as well, and not just him being really pissed off at that end due to that. But anyway, he was deemed to be at fault, and so he got the 5-second penalty, and at least he wasn't the 10-second penalty because of the very beginning lap, and so they were lenient, I think, on that regards, and he came back fairly strong, as we'll see here in a little bit, but doing a good job, I think. Overall, he had a good chance of winning this race, so we'll have to keep an eye out on those Red Bulls. There was all that rumor about them, falling apart and whatever, but yet they've won a race, and they've come back, and they probably really could have won this race without those circumstances. So we'll have to really keep an eye on the Red Bulls. And even though if it's just him running around, they can really put pressure on those McLarens, it looks like. He did pass Lewis on lap 24 for fourth position, and he was also voted driver of the day. Now, I'm not sure if I would vote him driver of the day overall. He did a good job, even with that penalty. And so I think that gave that driver of the day feel because he was able to potentially put pressure back on Oscar Piastri and the likes to see if he could come back even with that 5-second penalty and win the race, which gave it a nice, good tension throughout this race. But I'm not sure who I would actually give it to. And that's probably the problem too, is there wasn't a real clear indicator of who was a really good deserved for this weekend. It could have been Charles Leclerc because of the Ferrari state that Ferrari is in, and be able to maintain that and still get third, get it back on the podium. Or it could be, someone farther back in the field gaining some ground when they shouldn't have, like Lando Norris coming from 10th to 4th. But that doesn't seem quite as deserving as we've seen in the past. So I think that's a big struggle for this time. So who would you give the driver of the day to? I'd be kind of interested in seeing who you thought was the best deserving driver, not just the popular driver for this weekend. And then we come to Oscar Piastri, who started off in second and ended up in first. He did a one-stop, stopping 2 laps ahead on lap 19, switching from a set of mediums to a set of hards. He did have a really good start, coming along beside Max Verstappen, and then making Max Verstappen run wide on that corner, which cost him that penalty, because he should have probably pulled in behind Oscar, and yet he trying to drove through the corner and maintain that first position. And that kind of cost him, as they didn't really relinquish that. But he had a bad restart after that safety car, but he just managed to keep ahead of Russell behind him, keeping in that second position. So he had a fairly bad start on that and had to recover from that, maintain that second position and not lose that position to Russell, because if he had done that, he would have been in a lot worse trouble, even with that penalty that Max had. He did pass Lewis for 4th on lap 22, and that was his big passing on the inside of that, all the dirty marbles and everything. I know a lot of people and the commentators were kind of amazed at that pass, his dedication not to lose it in that corner, really put that on Lewis and get past him fairly quickly. But of course, then he got stuck behind some back markers. That cost him some extra time later on, but he did a really good job on that pass. That kind of ended the race where he's kind of able to come back out in that first position after the shuffle and after the penalty that was given to Max. And he was kind of maintained that for the most part for the rest of the race without too much trouble. And to show you that, basically we have the safety car that came out on lap 1. It lasted to lap 3 for the Gasly and Yuki contact that left Gasly's car out in the road. They had to go collect it. But by lap 5, Max had a 0.71 second lead over Oscar, not including the 5-second penalty. And then lap 10, it was a second lead over Oscar from Max. And lap 15, Max still had a 1.46 second lead over Oscar. And then we started doing the pit stop strategies. And so lap 25, we had a 3.3 second gap between Charles Leclerc, who is now in first, and Lando Norris. And then back to the normal schedule of lap 40, he had a 4.6 second lead for Oscar over Max. And by lap 50 at the end of the race, it was down to 2.8 seconds for Oscar over Max. So if you kind of look at that, even with that, Max was able to start pulling that gap away from Oscar, even through the back markers. And so that kind of put a little bit more tension. I think that gave that extra edge throughout this race to see Oscar pitted first. So there was the question of whether Max could go long and keep that gap, which didn't turn out to be the case. So he still fell behind. And then was Max going to be able to catch up to Oscar and then put pressure back on Oscar and take the lead again after all of that? And I think Max did an excellent job driving. Just had that one little mistake that cost him overall this race. So we'll have to keep an eye out for them. And of course, now Oscar, winning the race, takes the lead of the Drivers' Championship. So we have that nice battle for the Drivers' Championship currently between the 2 McLaren drivers, and how well McLaren's going to handle that in the future. Who's going to get preference? Who's going to get, feisty, start fighting each other, around the tracks, for who's going to be, coming out in the lead for that. I think that kind of gives a nice future for us to see how things are going to play out this season. Makes it really exciting, makes me kind of want to see where this is going to run. So what did this do to the drivers' standings? Well, we had Yuki fall back to 16th, where Carlos Sainz and Isaac Hajjar moved up a spot. So now Isaac is in 14th with 5 points, tied with Carlos, who's in 15th with 5 points, who's tied with Yuki, who dropped back to that 16th position. And then basically everyone stayed the same, kind of, gain a few points here and there on drivers ahead of them or from behind them. But the other change, of course, was Oscar taking the driver's standing lead over Lando. So he is now in the first position with 99 points over Lando's 89 points. But of course, Max Verstappen is right there behind Lando with 87. So we'll have to be careful of what that happens there. And of course, the others aren't too far away either, with George Russell and Charles Leclerc potentially, Kimi Antonelli, but then we start falling back a little bit into that running. So unless something drastic happens, we'll have that play out. So really the big fight now, I think, is between the McLaren drivers and if Max or George can actually poke their nose in there to cause some issues with them in this running. And for the constructor standing, what did that do? Well, Haas dropped back to 6th, keeping with 20 points, with Williams jumping up to 5th, now with 25. McLaren still in the lead now with 188 points over Mercedes 111, Ferrari with 78. So there's that gap there for those first 4, trying to put pressure on McLaren. We'll have to see if that plays out. And then of course you have the 5th and back with around that 20th point marker to see if that can happen there or not. Is it Haas going to be able to overtake Williams, or is Williams going to stretch out that lead for 5th? And of course, we have a couple of other ones like Racing Bulls. Are they going to get good, or is Alpine going to come back, as they've looked fairly good in the last 2 races? It just had some bad luck in this one. So will they come back strong and start putting more pressure on those back markers? Best of the rest. So what's coming up next? We have the US or Miami GP race. Not next weekend, but the weekend after. So we have a little bit of a break. On April 20th, we have that race, and it is going to have a length of 3.363 miles on that circuit, with 57 laps being run for a total race distance of 191.585 miles. It was first introduced in 2022, and current lap record holder is Max Verstappen in 2023 with 1 minute 29.708 seconds. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.